And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, Russ Baker with us, author of the best-selling investigative book Family of Secrets, and has written for major news organizations around the world. He's also the founder and editor-in-chief of the groundbreaking news site whowhatwhy.org, which specializes in digging into stories that most media barely touches and is seeking answers to the question, why? Russ, welcome back. It's been 5 years.
Oh, my God, George. I didn't realize it was that long.
Time has flown by. How have you been?
Really good, thank you.
And happy Thanksgiving to you, my friend.
Same to you, same to you.
How did you get involved in investigating the JFK assassination?
Well, you've had me on in the past to talk about my last book. My books take forever, of course. That was called Family of Secrets. And basically back in 2002, 2003, I began looking into the Bush family. I wanted to do a book about them because even though, of course, two Bushes had been presidents of the United States, I felt that we really didn't quite understand how this family had accrued as much power as they had. I found the books on them inadequate, and I thought, well, maybe I'll look into this. And so it turned into a 5-year project. And as I was really looking into the son, George W. Bush, because of the Iraq War and the deception there. I thought there was more there, and that led me to look at the son. How would the son become president? And the answer was, well, had his father not been president, he would not have been president. Then I started saying, okay, let's look at the father. How would the father become president? And I started going through the father's history. And the more I looked at him, the more I thought that he himself was an improbable man to have been president of the United States. And so I started asking people who knew the father, who had studied the father, what was it that made him president? And they were sort of stumped, and we thought about it. And they said, well, he had a bunch of positions of growing responsibility over the years. But when I looked at the positions, they were nothing, George. They were like, he was a member of the House of Representatives for a couple of terms, no great accomplishment. Mm-hmm. But then I noticed that he started getting all these opportunities. Richard Nixon appointed him. He became the head of the Republican Party around Watergate. He was an ambassador to an envoy, the first envoy to China. He was a UN ambassador. And I said, well, how did this guy, he really was not very articulate, hadn't accomplished, how did he get all these things? And what I discovered was that his father, in turn, a guy named Senator Prescott Bush, a very powerful investment banker from a powerful private banking firm out of New York, was super well connected. Anyway, as I looked at that, I saw that that's where the family's power came from. I could see that the father, Prescott, had basically some kind of control over Richard Nixon. I go into all of this stuff in Family of Secrets, and I realized that they had basically kind of made Nixon give George H.W. Bush the opportunities. Anyway, as I started looking at George H.W. Bush, I saw that one of the things was that he had been the director of the CIA. And, usually directors of the CIA know something about intelligence. I couldn't find any indication. He had been an oil man, supposedly, before his brief stint in politics. I thought, well, why right in the middle? They put George H.W. Bush, as the head of the CIA at the most sensitive point in that agency's entire history. I'm talking about in the 1970s, you remember the Church Committee. They were investigating whether the CIA was totally out of control, and totally doing whatever the heck it wanted, going around killing people all over the world, spying on Americans. And so this guy is the one they chose. I thought, well, that's crazy. Why did they choose him? And as I started looking at him and his whole background, I just went through things, and I saw that somebody had asked him, where were you when major things happened? You've lived such an interesting life. And they asked him, where were you on November 22, 1963? And what do you remember? And, well, we could all answer that, but he couldn't. He kind of blanched. He went white, and he said, I don't remember where I was, somewhere in Texas, he said. I thought, well, that's strange. I'll look into it. And that began what now has been, George, almost 2 decades of research on my part into the Kennedy assassination.
Interesting, because you're right. Those of us who were alive then remember exactly where we were. I was in English class, and I had my teacher on a couple of years ago, Nancy Leonard, who came in to tell us the president's been shot. And we were just kids. We didn't know what the heck was going on. You know, she was crying and all upset. But I had her on. But you're right. We who were alive during that period remember exactly where we were when we heard that story.
Yeah, and so I thought, well, that's strange. Well, maybe I'll just find out where he was. And so I began reading and looking at things, and I found that he was a candidate for United States Senate. He lost, but he was the Republican nominee for U.S. Senate from Texas. He was running at that time. So you would think, well, gosh, I mean, if you were running for U.S. Senate from Texas, and the President of the United States and the Vice President and all of the press corps were in Dallas, I mean, you'd probably want to be there. And amazingly, George, we found that not only was Bush there, who would become a president, but so were Kennedy, of course, and then Lyndon Johnson, who would become president, and Richard Nixon. That's another amazing story. By a strange, you might call it coincidence, happened to be in Dallas that morning as well. And so you had all of these current and future presidents there at the same time. But anyway, Bush said he couldn't remember, and I thought that was strange. And I looked and looked and looked and looked, and I eventually found a little newspaper ad for the night before that he was speaking at a hotel in Dallas. That's the night before at a meeting of offshore oil drillers. And he was ostensibly himself an offshore oil driller. Now, he's never made a mention of it. And if you look at his own books, he never mentions the Kennedy assassination at all. He doesn't mention how he felt about it. He doesn't say where he was. He just skips it. And that struck me as very, very strange.
Was he afraid that some people were going to accuse him of something?
Well, I mean, the answer is if you start looking into him and what he was doing, what I have concluded, I'll just cut to the chase, but again, my previous book, Family of Secrets, it goes into this stuff in great detail. But what I found was that this oil drilling company that he had looked to be almost certainly CIA cover. In other words, George H.W. Bush, the reason they made him a CIA director in the 1970s when he had no so-called experience or qualifications, but he actually did have experience and qualifications. In other words, he'd already been working for a couple of decades undercover as a CIA operative using the oil business as his cover. And so in 1963, he had this offshore drilling company. He was traveling all over the world, and I had the opportunity to go through some of his business papers, and his trips made no sense, George. He was going to all these places where there was no oil, where there was no offshore drilling, where his company had no business, and everywhere he went, there were CIA stations. I actually connected him, and some of his closest friends were active duty, very key CIA people around the world, and so you see him. And in 1963, by the way, he goes on what he calls his world tour. And again, this guy runs a small, non-profitable oil drilling company, and he's going all over the world. He's meeting up with these CIA people. He calls it his world tour, ostensibly for business and to see friends. And I even discovered that the week that Kennedy was shot, there was a man visiting who was one of the CIA's key heads of running coups. In other words, of overthrowing people. He was living abroad. He had left the CIA. A bunch of them left. Kennedy basically pushed some of the key people out because he was very, very frustrated with what the CIA was up to. He thought that they were not serving the president or the public interest. And so one of the people who left was a fellow who went to live in London. And George went to visit him. And then we find that he comes to visit George in Dallas in the week of November 22. This is the guy who runs CIA coups, and this was all hidden. It was all hidden. I discovered it through a very complex chain of things while I was doing my research.
It's amazing. My previous guest, Mark Shaw, great investigator, talked about how LBJ and Hoover kind of stonewalled the Warren Commission and pushed them into the Lee Harvey Oswald single gunman theory. You've got your own thoughts from your website, whowhatwhy.org.
Yeah, we're running a whole series of articles on these topics. And one of our articles you can find there is about a little noticed conversation between Johnson and Hoover within some days after the assassination, and they're talking about what they know, and basically Johnson is saying he's talking about the shooters. Now, Lee Oswald has already been arrested. He's dead. Jack Ruby had already shot him some days ago. And Johnson's saying now when they're shooting and Hoover is saying they, which is strange because they said it was just Oswald himself. And they describe how John Connally, Governor John Connally of Texas, sitting right in front of Kennedy in the motorcade going forward. Oswald is in the back of them. And, of course, the official story from the Warren Commission, as you referenced, is that they were hit in the back and that a bullet went through Kennedy and then hit Connally in all these strange ways. They came to call that the magic bullet because it seems like it did some ballet in the air to make that work. Anyway, to make it a lone gunman theory, they had to have that bullet do all that damage. But in this little noted interview, Johnson says, so basically Connally got hit because he got in the way of Kennedy, and Hoover says that's right. Now, that could, if he got in the way and he's sitting in front of Kennedy, I mean, it means they thought that was a shot from the front.
From the front, it had to come from the front if he got in the way. That's interesting, and nobody caught that.
Nobody caught that.
That is interesting. Now, you've come across a strange story of a guy named David Harold Byrd. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Oh, my gosh. Well, so this started fairly early on because the way I work is I just try to kind of, connect dots, and I tend to look into things that often other people will say, well, that's sort of obscure. But, of course, Lee Oswald, we are told, shot Kennedy from a building called the Texas School Book Depository, and all these years we've heard the building referred to that, and I thought, well, what is that building? What was Lee Oswald doing working in it and so forth? And so over many, many years, and I actually wrote about this all the way back in Family of Secrets. I get into this already. Oswald got a job in that building about 5-6 weeks before the assassination. Now, the interesting thing about that is if he were planning to kill Kennedy, that would have been his reason to get the job in the building. The thing was nobody in the public knew that Kennedy was coming to Dallas, and they certainly didn't know that he was going to have a motorcade, and they didn't know that what the route was, and they didn't know that the route was going to go by that building.
Right.
So nobody really gets into this, but the whole question of how it is that Oswald happened to be able to shoot Kennedy, they're claiming this was all spontaneous. They're claiming that he just happened to have a job in that building, and he happened to see in the newspaper that week, oh, my gosh, Kennedy's coming by. Well, I'll just go get a rifle, and I'll shoot him. Now, we also have an interview on our site with a man who was his best friend when, Oswald lived in the USSR for several years. He's a little hard to understand, a heavy accent, but we've got a transcript. I'd recommend reading the transcript to get a little clearer. But this man, who I've spent a lot of time with, describes Lee Oswald as an educated, friendly young man who, though he was in Russia because he was interested in learning about the Soviet system and comparing it to the U.S. system, he said that this guy was not a communist at all. In fact, he says that he was rather moderate in his views, and he defended the U.S., and he criticized the USSR. Well, the whole story we're told is that he was a disgruntled communist, leftist guy who shot Kennedy. Well, why even shoot Kennedy anyway, who was a liberal? And I've interviewed other people who knew Oswald, and they have told me that, no, he was a great fan of John F. Kennedy, and there was zero chance that he would have had any reason to kill him. But anyway, there he is. He's in this building for some reason, and so then I say, okay, well, what is this building? What was he doing there? So I don't want to rush you, but I can get into that whole story.
No, we've got time. Go ahead.
Okay, all right. So it turns out that the Texas School Book Depository is not really a building at all. What it is it's a company. It's a company. It's a tenant, And very often you think about the so-and-so building and you think that's the name of the building, but it's really the name of the anchor tenant, the largest tenant who's rented a lot of space there. And so what I discovered was that the building was called something else, and it was largely empty. And it was owned by a man named David Harold Byrd, very, very powerful fellow.
He bought it. He bought it in the 1930s, I bet.
That's right. And you can read at whowhatwhy.org. We have a separate article on this, go into all the detail. But anyway, he had this building, and it was largely empty. And then a company, and again, this is in very few other books. Nobody really bothered with this. A company called the Texas School Book Depository Company moved into the building, and then they gave Lee Oswald a job, and then supposedly he shot Kennedy. Now, you'd think that someone other than me would want to dig into all this, investigators, committees, and so on, but they didn't. And so I thought, well, what's this whole thing about? So I looked into the Texas School Book Depository Company, was run by a very right-wing man who ran one of the local posts of the American Legion. They were very close with the FBI and with the intelligence community. But the owner of the building itself, who arranged for this company to move in, was D.H. Byrd, and he was a oil wildcatter. They called him D.H. Dry Hole Byrd because he drilled so many dry holes before he struck it. But then he struck it big. He became one of the wealthiest people. He married, I believe maybe she was the wealthiest woman at the time, married her. And then he just became a real force. And he was a pilot. He liked to fly, and he got into aviation. He got into he was one of the founders of something called the Civil Air Patrol, which trained these cadets as a kind of a auxiliary to the U.S. air power. And by the way, one of the members of the Civil Air Patrol when he was in his teens was a fellow named Lee Harvey Oswald.
Oh, wow, and he was also related to Richard Byrd, the explorer.
Distantly. But you see, Byrd, because this Byrd had a lot of money, he wanted that glory, so he began sponsoring the explorer and connecting the explorer because he wanted to play up that connection. But anyway, Harold Byrd became very, very powerful. He got big in defense contracting. He got big in uranium mining, all the things for the war machine. Got very, very big. And one of his good friends was a guy named Lyndon Johnson.
Aha. Interesting.
Yeah. And in fact, they were so close that at one point, Byrd, flying his own plane, was heading over to the LBJ Ranch. He said, he said, "Hey, Lyndon, I'm coming down." And Johnson said, no. He was busy, and he didn't care that this guy, was president of the United States. He said, well, he just landed anyway. So, you could almost ask who was more powerful than who. But anyway, Byrd did whatever he wanted. He owned this building. And what I discovered, and this struck, in a mountain of coincidences, is kind of amazing. 62, Lee Oswald, I won't go into all that background. That would take us 20 hours here. But Lee Oswald he's been in the Soviet Union. He's returned to the United States with a Russian wife, Marina, and they're living in Fort Worth. And then suddenly, around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, he moves suddenly to Dallas. And when he moves to Dallas, he's sort of being squired. He meets first in Fort Worth and then in Dallas by a guy named George de Mohrenschildt, a sort of a Russian, what they call white Russian a nobleman who's in the oil business and who travels around the world doing mysterious things. It shows up being debriefed by the CIA. Anyway, this George de Mohrenschildt kind of takes Oswald on under his wing and begins helping him and his wife, helps him look for jobs, drives him around, and so on. Right in that period, George de Mohrenschildt begins a local chapter for the illness cystic fibrosis. And he puts together a board, and on his board he puts, are you ready? Mrs. D.H. Byrd.
Mrs. Interesting. We're going to come back and chat more with you, Russ, in a moment. And welcome back. George Norrie along with Russ Baker. Russ, Marina Oswald, who's not Oswald anymore, she's since been remarried, is now 82, still lives in Texas, and has basically admitted that after she talked to the Warren Commission that she thought Lee might be guilty, has backtracked a lot and doesn't think that he was part of it at all. What do you think?
She does not believe that that he was involved. Although she doesn't know what was what. You know, you have to remember that she was a teen when she met him. You know, and as she points out, I mean, he was 24 years old when he died. I mean, most of us, I mean, what had we even done by the time we were 24? I mean, this guy had gone, you know, around the world. He'd done all kinds of things, and he was already accused of killing the President of the United States and dead. So she doesn't know, but she doesn't believe that he would have done that. She understands that he may have been involved in something, and my evidence, based on the many years of research I've done, is that he was involved in something, but what he was involved in is something quite different. And another article on our website, whowhatwhy.org, O-R-G, is a very interesting article about Lee Oswald leaving the Marines, getting a discharge, and then going in a rush to the Soviet Union. And, of course, that has been used to say, well, he was a leftist, but all you have to do is look at that to see that he had inside information on how you get in to the Soviet Union. And we write all about that. He knew things that nobody knew about how to get right in there, and there was something going on. They had a thing called the false defector program. They were sending, because the U.S. lacked intelligence assets on the ground in the Soviet Union, they urgently needed them. And so, by all indications, a number of people, servicemen and others, were being sent in there, and it looks like that's what Lee was doing. And I think Marina is aware of that distinct possibility.
Under the guise of being a double agent or something like that, when they're really working for the United States government.
Yeah, and of course the Soviets were no dopes, and so when a guy like him shows up, they immediately suspect he's an agent. And so this, George, is this kind of cat and mouse game. In other words, they're putting these people in there to sort of feel everything out. They want to see who approaches you. You know, who talks to you? Does the KGB approach you? You see, and so they're putting him in. They're putting these people in as a probe to start monitoring the situation on the ground.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's just so much. Mark Shaw got involved heavily in the Dorothy Kilgallen death. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, one doesn't want to rush to judgment, but there were so many people looking into things, saying things. I mentioned to you, and I know that she died under strange circumstances, but so did literally dozens, scores of people. And as you know, I'm working on another book. I've been working on a Kennedy book now. It's good. By the time I've finished, it'll have been at least a couple of decades. I am far along. But in that book, I'll be describing a lot of these strange deaths. Very, very weird, the timing. Many of them, as they were about to be called in to testify to subsequent investigative panels. This man, George de Mohrenschildt, who was squiring Lee Oswald, had just received a subpoena to come to Washington and testify, and he supposedly went home, a man who we know was scared of guns, and somehow took a shotgun, which is not easy to do, and supposedly blew his own brains out. So, yeah, you got some questions there.
Is he the guy that Jim Garrison was investigating?
No, you're talking about Clay Shaw, I think.
Okay. I know Clay Shaw was one of them. And
by the way, Clay Shaw, that's a whole other story about this group in New Orleans around Lee Oswald. And you know, Clay Shaw, we, you know, have records showing that he was tied to the CIA. So, I mean, the CIA is all over this thing. The FBI is all over this thing. I mean, those people who insist to this day, and that's most of our media, insist that the official story that it was Oswald, a disgruntled leftist. I mean, it's not even a child should believe this stuff. I mean, the evidence it's so overwhelming. It's right in front of us. You have to be really, really in denial to still buy that.
Whoever packaged Oswald as the possible assassin did a good job doing that, didn't they?
They did a great job. And then going back to that building, just to briefly, and again, people can read this on whowhatwhy.org, all the detail, but as I continue to look at this Harold Bird, and I don't know how involved or what his involvement was, but obviously, as I say, close friend of Johnson, offered this building. Johnson's people pushed for a route where the Kennedy's car went right by the building. Bird allows this company to move in. The company hires Oswald, and by the way, they hire Oswald. And they're a textbook company. They ship textbooks to the schools. They ship mainly once a year.
It was like a warehouse, wasn't it?
Yeah. And so the orders come in, and they ship their orders out. And the orders go out, basically in the early summer. They go out so that the school districts have the books when school starts. But what you see is that they have very few order pickers, but they hire Oswald. And I found a oral history account with the widow of the man who owned the book company that hired Oswald, and she says, "Yeah, well, we usually laid off our people because there really wasn't much business this time of year. But my husband met Oswald and." It seemed like a nice fellow, and they said, well, let's try to give him some work. And they said they were giving him work laying flooring. And very interesting, what was going on? The week of November 22, they were ostensibly laying new floors on the 6th floor of the school book depository.
Interesting. Did people like him?
Here's another interesting thing, George, and I've talked to many, many people who knew him, including this interview we have on Who, What, Why with his friend from Russia, and they liked him. And this man says that the portrayal of him as a nasty fellow, as a loner, eccentric, he says it's bull. He says this guy was friendly, he was intelligent, he was well-read. He loved to discuss philosophy and politics and history and literature and music. That he was, he describes him as a very likable, grounded person. So completely the opposite. If you read the Warren Commission, they find these people come up there and they talk about him being violent and this and that, and it doesn't seem to be true.
Two things confuse me about Oswald. One is the J.D. Tippit police officer situation where Oswald apparently shot him to death and was picked up and arrested in a theater. What was that all about?
Well, it's hard to know, and certainly I put, as many others have, a lot of time into this over the years. The best I can figure out, and again, this is just based on a whole sort of constellation of factors, is that, you see, the Tippit shooting was critical because, see, nobody saw Oswald shoot Kennedy. There were no eyewitnesses.
No, none.
So how would you say it was Oswald? Well, they said they found his gun, but that's a whole other thing. I don't know if you remember that, but they held up a rifle, and it was identified as a .765 Mauser. And all the news articles say that the Mauser was found in the warehouse. By the next day, they were saying it was a Mannlicher Carcano. Well, excuse me. These guys are sheriffs and police. Many of them were gun experts, and they held up the gun. You even see a guy on video looking right at the barrel, okay? So those two guns are not the same. And that was very strange, and it almost looks like they screwed up. And this happens, by the way. I can tell you, I run a news organization. Screw-ups happen constantly, right? So they screwed up. They were supposed to put a Mannlicher Carcano there, and somebody put a Mauser there, and it was like, whoops. And so they had to switch it, and they said to the press, nobody even asked, well, how come you said it was a Mauser, on Friday, and by Saturday it's a Mannlicher Carcano? But anyway, so you got nothing. You got very little on Oswald, and there's no evidence really that he even owned a rifle. Although Marina, you have to know, Marina was being heavily pressured to say certain things.
Sure.
And she was supposed to say,
and she was scared. She was scared to death. She was 22 years old.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you something, George. I interview people now, and I just got back from Texas, and they're scared now.
Still.
Oh, they're terrified.
That's
I'm talking about the major people in this story are going to take this thing to their graves.
Most people have died, haven't they?
There are quite a few who are still alive, believe it or not, because they were, in their 20s at the time, and maybe now they're 80 or in their 80s.
All right. Anyways, put Oswald in that theater. What was that all about?
So anyway, so basically, all you've got is that Oswald worked in a building that plenty of other people worked in. they're saying that the shots came from there, but as you know, when the thing began, most of the people ran up the grass toward that parking lot up ahead and thought that the shots had come from there. The overwhelming majority thought the shots came from there until the police said, no, we think the shots came from the building, and then the attention shifted to the building. Now, they found Oswald, you know this, and he was standing on the second floor in a lunchroom. They say the shots came to the sixth floor. About 90 seconds after the shots were fired, they run into Oswald standing by a Coke machine, holding a Coke, calmly, not sweating, looking absolutely normal, and he says, what's all the commotion?
Exactly.
So I got to say, this guy would have been the world's best actor and athlete to do that. But anyway, so they got nothing on this guy. Okay, now, that day, sometime later, the people leave. They go home. He leaves the building. And sometime later, suddenly you hear police officer shot. Well, as soon as you hear police officer shot, what happens is law enforcement goes nuts. That's a special code. People start thinking that could have been me, and they really get fired up. So now, whatever, and by the way, a lot of people in Dallas, police and others, did not like Kennedy. I assume you know that. There was a lot of conservatives there. They did not like Kennedy. And so, people made callous remarks after he was shot. There were schools where children cheered when they heard that he'd been shot in Dallas. Yeah, and so you have to know that the police in general were not well disposed to Kennedy, who was already doing things for racial desegregation. This was a very, very conservative place. But anyway, so Kennedy gets shot, and it's like, oh, my gosh, Kennedy's been shot. Well, we didn't like him. But then they hear that one of their own, a police officer, has been shot. Now everybody goes nuts, okay? And they're all racing to the scene of where this police officer was shot. Well, who shot the policeman? We don't know. And then suddenly comes the word, a guy was seen going into a movie theater. Well, I mean, come on. Somebody's going into a movie theater? I mean, why would you be suspicious? They didn't even know what he looked like.
And what was Tippett shot by, a pistol or a rifle?
He was shot by a pistol. And this gets into a whole other story. It's a long, long, long story. But basically, there are a number of possibilities here. There is a possibility, I think, somewhat remote, that Oswald realized that he was a marked man and that there was an effort to frame him. Because you remember he said, I'm a patsy.
Well, I'm going to ask you about that because I have ideas, and let's see if we can work on that. But go ahead.
Sure, yeah. Well, we'll keep this in mind, by the way. They all say, well, why did Oswald shoot Kennedy? Well, number one, everybody who knew him said that he loved Kennedy, okay? So that doesn't make sense. Number two, if he's a leftist, why shoot Kennedy, who is trying to have a rapprochement with the Soviets? So why would you do that, right? So it doesn't make sense on any level. Then people say, well, he did it because he wanted to be famous. He wanted to be known to history. But then if he wanted to be known to history, why did he say to the police, I did not do it?
That's right. Which leads me to this question. With today's technology, and we've got incredible technology, can we take that audio clip where he says, I'm a patsy, and have them decide whether he's telling the truth or not with that clip?
That's a great idea. I vaguely recall.
There's got to be some technology out there that instantly can tell you if you're telling the truth or not.
Yeah, there is a voice. What's the right word I'm looking for? There is a technology they use to listen to a voice to see if somebody's telling the truth. I thought I had somebody do that some years ago. I'm going to have to go back and look at my notes. But I do know anecdotally that when I presented that to people who are experts, they said they had no reason to think that he was lying.
See if you can find somebody, Russ. We'll pay for it. And let's see what they might conclude.
Okay, sure enough. Well, anyway, just common sense. If this guy was trying to become world famous for killing the president, and he said, I didn't do it, and he used the word patsy, that's a very interesting word. That word specifically means I am being set up for somebody else's thing.
Exactly. I'm not sure he knew what was happening, but they framed him. They used him. They knew all along they were going to make everybody see, because it came out instantly, didn't it, in newspapers? About Oswald?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They immediately, and by the way, they didn't give this guy a lawyer. Think about that. They did not give him a lawyer. And he wanted them to make a phone call to somebody. See, his problem was that if he was working as I think he was for U.S. intelligence, he was set up for this whole thing. He was in that building because he was told to be in that building. He was told he was in there for some reason, but he wasn't told that Kennedy's going to be shot or that you're going to be blamed for it. And so you could imagine. He was used to playing roles. He was a pretty cool customer if he'd already been through the Soviet Union and hadn't blinked an eye. And so he was able to stay. He wasn't screaming when he was in the building, but he was scared. And he was very, very nervous. He was very worried about what was going on. But let's get back to the Tippit shooting. So the Tippit shooting happens, and they say there are these stories that a man went into a theater. Now, so what, a man went into a theater? They didn't say, a man went into a theater with a gun blazing. They just said a man went into a theater. And the stories about the theater, this will all be in my next book when it finally comes out. All the detail on the stories about the theater are inconsistent, and they keep changing the story. Somebody says, that the woman in the ticket booth saw him go in without buying a ticket. No, that's not the right story. Another story is that a man owned a shoe store down the block, saw a fellow walk by and look in the window, and then was suspicious of him. Well, what, any shoe store anywhere in the city, you're suspicious if a guy looks in your window. So he says that he went out of the shop, walked down the block, and they claims that he saw this man go into the theater and that called police. So there's a lot of inconsistent stories about why you would even be interested in a man who went into a theater. But anyway, next thing you know, the police, hit the place and they arrest him. There's a whole story. There's two different wallets.
Hold on for 1 second, Russ. So I want to pick that up right there and ask you if Oswald indeed was in that theater when they got him.